Our first presenter will tell us how CPG companies can safeguard their margins in today's evolving landscape. Joining me now is Joel Cartwright, Industry Principal Consumer Products with Vistex. Joel, the podium is yours.
Thanks, John. It's always a pleasure to speak at the conference. So my name is Joel Cartwright, as John mentioned. I've been in the consumer packaged goods industry for about 25 plus years. I started on the financial side in companies like Sara Lee Foods, St. Louis, Kimberly Clark. We've done different sales operations, sales finance roles. For the last 15 years or so, I've been focused on the trade promotion software and revenue growth management software, product management, and so forth, as well as working with clients, both existing and new opportunities at Vistex, which help them kind of manage what's going through. So one of the interesting things an industry principal does, it's my job to ensure that I have a good understanding of what the trends are happening within the industry. Number one. Number two, working closely, as I mentioned, with our existing clients to help identify what hurdles or trends that they need to overcome, and then understanding how the market is evolving with them. One of the big trends we're seeing when I talk to customers, specifically customers who are in the business to business side, the old side of the business, essentially, where there's a lot of products sold through distributors, sold through to third-party entities, group purchasing organizations, so forth. And what we're finding that these companies historically, were not as in tune with the cost volatility and the increased market complexity and labor shortages. And these are the trends that we're seeing. They're coming to us and saying, historically, I could help with my margins and encompass the cost volatility. And the market's becoming more and more complex with food away from home and different entities entering the market. And of course, the labor shortage. And what they're finding out, there's just these things that they can't control. But what they're doing is they're coming to us and trying to understand, help me understand the things that I can control that will help remedy what I just mentioned, the cost volatility, complex markets. People are buying each other and people are consolidating and so forth. In these particular areas is how can I control and prevent margin erosion, contract pricing, and unravel that complex market contracts that ultimately are causing them revenue leakage, and how ultimately to automate business processes and eliminate manual intervention through digitalization components. So as I mentioned too, the food service business-to-business component is one of the primary industries that Vistex involves in. Of course, we're also in the retail business, consumer packaged goods for both retail and food service. We work with wholesalers, retailers, and distributors and so forth within this category. But these are manufacturers who are selling food and beverage related supplies to distributors and redistributors to sell those products to end customers. This is the food away from home, as it were. This is perishable foods and supporting products for food away from home consumption, which is a big shift within this marketplace. It's no longer really referred to as the food service business. It's really food away from home, because they're seeing this food away from home coming out of groceries and so forth, where ready prepared meals or the home delivery service. So the industry itself is really, really evolving. So what I'd like to do is kind of go through these industry trends that in one by one, essentially, like I said, that we're seeing with the industry, and our clients and opportunities are reinforcing with us, particularly in this marketplace, the food away from home or business to business. What is happening is this pressure is building to drive margin wholeness. I have to prevent margin erosion. I need to prevent revenue leakage. I need to automate these business processes, which are impacting and causing margin erosion, causing revenue leakage. I need to be more proactive in the decision making. And all this starts with a digitalization journey. So I always ask, just to reassure, what's driving this? I think this is pretty much a no-brainer. Costs are up 98% by operators. There are higher labor costs. Issues with their restaurants, 97% are just higher food price costs. 38% say restaurants are just not profitable like they were last year. And this is coming from the National Restaurant Association. So really, what's driving this is that commodity price spikes and the volatility in the marketplace. It's difficult to plan out a business plan and plan out pricing. There's a record rise in the CPI, which is driving those costs up as well. And labor shortages. I know we've said this a lot, but there is a labor shortage trend. It's getting better. It's starting to kind of even out, but there's still that volatility in the marketplace. And this is what's driving that margin erosion and that revenue leakage. And what it's causing is this roller coaster of volatility, the roller coaster and the inability to really understand what that's going to be to keep margins whole. So historically, when we would talk to our clients or companies who come to us, they would say, well, there wasn't really a lot of focus on this. We were really profitable and able to manage this through our pricing structure, and there wasn't much impact that we could do and could control. So we just said, I'm just not going to prioritize this. There wasn't the raw material and production cost fluctuation. And what they found out is they didn't really require any sort of stopgap or controls that need to be put in place when they're sending field sales representatives out in the field or negotiating contracts and negotiating pricing. And pricing is a whole other discussion around maintenance and optimization of that pricing and so forth, which we may cover at a later date. But what they're seeing is that their margin goals and focusing all these cost controls, they need to do this is they need to either increase the margin by 3 to 5% by inputting these cost controls in place, or at least maintaining it. So historically, all this focus on controls and stopgap capabilities within contract management, contract pricing, and complexity were just not in place. So now with this, pressure coming, we have manufacturers, we have distributors and so forth coming to us and saying, I need to reprioritize this. You need to help me do this. And ultimately what we find is we have to prevent it from the outset. We have to say, what sort of stopgaps can we put in place? What kind of things that could help, we could put in place to help negate and the negative impact on margin? Ultimately, what that means is it starts with this contract pricing. There's multiple levels of it. There's quantity or season. There's a lot of fluctuation in demand. These uncontrollable rising costs we've talked about are forcing manufacturers really to better understand this, and they need to get a better control on it. And what it starts with is, how can I put those controls in place? I have multiple areas, software components and so forth, because I don't have a streamlined IT ecosystem to bring all that information into one area, which it can then in turn act in real time to create and help put in place these stopgap controls. So what they're looking for is a way to say, okay, how can I have some sort of a smart contract pricing that helps when I create these allowances that at a distributor or at entities and so forth, that can prevent an overlap. What can I see, downstream? Historically, some of this was managed in Excel. So digitalizing this process and bringing all this together. So when an end user creates an allowance in a contract, it says, well, wait a minute. You already have this overlapping contract at a first party or the first tier of the supply chain distribution, or maybe the second tier. So you start to overlapping, which is in turn impacting a dead net. And that's something else that manufacturers are trying to understand. I need to start putting in a dead net component or a dead net stopgap in place to prevent that margin threshold impact. So when an end user creates this, it says, well, wait a minute, I've got all these cost components downstream, again, throughout the supply chain tiers, that if I create this one contract and put it at this contract price point, it gives me an alert that says, wait a minute, we can't do this. So all that in turn requires a lot of information. It has to have those updated cost impacts per selling unit. It has to be done in real time on those costs encompassing production processing, raw material, transportation, distribution. And when we work with manufacturers, they say, well, my production processing, raw material, all those costs are in different units. So the first step that they start thinking of is saying, all right, how can I streamline my internal IT ecosystem to encompass all that software and that data information into one data pool? So they start looking at, how can I bring all that stuff into line? The other area that it was always really amazing to me that a lot of manufacturers, in this place, they of course provide a value incentive pricing. And again, this is another area to say, well, wait a minute, I get the incentives. It's just easy for me as an account manager to put this incentive. Okay, if you buy 1,000 units at this price, I'll give it to you, and you get it and reach it by this certain time period, I'll give it to you in additional price. Oh, there's no analysis. There's nothing that's done. It's more of a handshake or a back of the napkin type of negotiation for volume incentive pricing. So what manufacturers are telling us, I've got this other component around this incentive capabilities that I need. I need some sort of stopgap to say, well, wait a minute, the incentive contract that you're negotiating, it's going below that dead net. So there has to be that component in the initial offering. The other component, which really, really surprised me, manufacturer came to us and said, I have this margin erosion, this volatility on my volume incentive pricing. And I was like, well, help me understand what's going on. Well, come to find out, very simply, when the customer would take for a price or look for a volume incentive allowance, the ordering system was not validating that they actually purchased the volume or they actually even shipped the volume. And that was another thing, too, that got uncovered during the supply chain crunch, was saying, all right, purchase orders were coming in for this volume amount, but I was only able to create this much inventory. So I shorted the customer, but yet they still took the volume allowance as if they got the inventory. So there was a huge disconnect in all these areas, in the simple words of, are they complying with the contract agreement? So again, that was another roadblock or obstacle, that they didn't have these systems talking together. And historically, it didn't become a problem until it was unveiled due to some sort of supply chain or some sort of issue, which was that's a lot of customers said, yeah, the supply chain distribution or disruption was bad, but it uncovered a lot of problems and issues. So at the end of the day, we're pretty much easy to understand the challenges in this business. The business is controls. There's just no controls in place. There's no compliance. There's no controls and compliance on these one-off deals. So ultimately, the idea is to get into a digitalized IT ecosystem to prevent all this stuff. So it's important to understand that putting all this information in one spot and making it more in real time is the journey where these manufacturers or entities in this channel are going through right now. It's a digitalization journey. You hear that a lot. When we speak with opportunities and clients currently, we always try to understand where you are on this digitalization journey. Where are you on this ultimate connection of all these internal software components? Because again, goes back to the trend that we see a lot. I see a lot in the space is I need to consolidate my IT footprint as well. Can I get more processes done by one system rather than having multiple systems, which is contradictory to what historically would take place. 10 years ago, manufacturers and entities in this space were looking for gap fill type of software applications to fulfill a certain business process. That's going away. It's created that disconnect through the IT ecosystem. So margin wholeness is really another area, and going through this digital journey is just going to solve that problem. The other thing that we talk about, or I see a lot of, is as a manufacturer, distributor in this space, my complex contracts, my markets are getting more and more complex, and which in turn takes multiple overlapping contracts, incentives, and so forth, SKU level contract pricing, in and outs of these contracts become very, very complex. The biggest component of revenue leakage, what we found, is multiple current Vistex customers or prospects are saying that this is what the biggest impact on my revenue leakage is this complex contract. I can't enforce that. There's got to be a better way to unravel and enforce all these contracts. Again, it falls back to there's manual processes. It's done in Excel, reconciliation on the back end processing. All these processes are related. COGS, visibility downstreams. Again, there's just stop gaps that are needed. How can I digitalize this to make an unravel complexity of contracts in complex markets? So it's all going through. These are the four key areas that we looked at. How can we automate and digitalize these processes? Because this is the user story. I need to better manage this complexity to prevent revenue leakage. The complexity is around multiple layers of the contracts and managing those. Because these contracts are very complex, what we have to work with or have to do is, how can I make my accrual accuracy better with all this complexity? More importantly, in this space, there's something, if you may not be familiar within the space, there's a 3-tier distribution volume. In the business-to-business space, there is a multiple touch points through this channel. So it's important to understand where the volume is, where the volume has been sold to, and understanding this 3-tier distribution model. And then, of course, managing that age-old chargeback claim settlement reconciliation process. How can we automate this process? In a prior presentation I did here with CPG Matters, we talked about how can AI be applied to this? So how can AI be applied to automating this chargeback claim reconciliation process? So the user stories and what manufacturers are telling us, these are the 3 key areas. This is what I was talking about, that 3-tier distribution model. What manufacturers are telling us, I need to understand when I sell product to a wholesaler, they in turn sell product to operator, then out. I need to have a better understanding of what we like to refer to as a volume pool, where the volume gets drained on the manufacturer and moves to a wholesaler. In turn, where that volume gets drained, the wholesaler moves to operator. I need to understand where the volume is. So I need to automate this process of saying, okay, when volume drains here, it's going here, and how it's sold out. And then, of course, the sell-out volume fills the pool back at the operator and the wholesaler, so I can understand it from a demand standpoint. So there's this tangled web of complex markets that is occurring between the manufacturer and the end consumer of how that volume touch points. And when you factor in online shopping, when you factor in online distribution of meals, meal preparation, so forth, you add in now the retailers that are going in the space of going into the kind of food away from home space. It's just further adding to the complexity of this marketplace. So as I mentioned today, the complex contracts are really a huge component of revenue leakage. And there has to be a better way. And this is solved through automation of all this processes. How can I automate and update all this information, have visibility downstream, and then put that? And ultimately what that boils down to is digitalization of the data, moving it out of Excel, centralizing the data into one source, and then automate that into an application that in turn can interpret the data and then spit out suggestions, so forth. That doesn't necessarily encompass maybe AI, but it's certainly putting all that information into one place. It is important. In addition to that is the accrual accuracy and understanding my spending. I know this is kind of rudimentary type of information, and this is something you would think manufacturers would have their arms around and have their hands on. But ultimately, it's always overwhelming to me when I talk to manufacturers and entities in the space. The simple idea of having a good, accurate accrual from a sheer general ledger accounting perspective, they don't have a good handle on that. Understanding their spend liability, how much money is out there, and even had to go into discussions of, let's talk about spend liability. What is it? It's when you're balancing your checkbook. So it's helping kind of manufacturers and entities in space getting back more to the fundamentals to better understand it, because those are areas that we can reprioritize, as I talked about at the beginning, reprioritize and focus on to really get that bang for the buck from eliminating revenue leakage and improving margin erosion. So we talked about the 3-tier distribution model volume that I showed you. That's the screen. But the idea is to track that inventory across all these distribution tiers, but more importantly, aligning it to the accruals, orders, returns, etc. So at Vistex, we offer that capability. It's the way to track that information. In addition to that, tracking the inventory, there's the validation component. Is the volume really sold when customers are taking a claim? Again, this is automating this process. If I have a good understanding of where the inventory is at for my distribution tier, it makes it so much easier for me to validate any sort of claim. And ultimately, that drives a visibility to what I talked about before. Getting back to the fundamentals of accurate volume drives for accurate accruals. True inventory counts, helps with spending liabilities. And these are just very, very fundamental aspects of the business where I talk to different current clients and existing and potential clients, that these are the areas that help you focus on, because that's going to give you the most bang for the buck, because these are things you can control. Talking about the two is that settlement process, getting back to the fundamentals and validating the negotiating price, product shipped to the customer. I've got all this things that are going on, and digitalizing this process and bringing it back helps with the overall margin erosion. So what's the manufacturer saying? I need this stopgap. I need this alert. I just don't have a clear picture to all this stuff. There is this contract complexity that there's volume sold, but distributor operation validation. There's spending liabilities, latest estimates over. These are the stopgaps that these manufacturers and entities are looking for within the application. So these are two of the trends. They're kind of related, complex markets, margin erosion, volatility. But it's always amazing, extent over the last couple of years, in speaking with these clients, that because the supply chain crunch has kind of unmasked this problem, which is probably going a long time, it's the reprioritization of it. So another thing that, again, very similar to the volatility in the marketplace and so forth, is what's unmasking problems is the labor shortage. Historically, this marketplace was heavily reliable on manual processing to do kind of the standard business processes. And what we're seeing is, and this is IFMA, very respected international food service manufacturers, which they just rebranded, but they're saying is that manufacturers selling this are grappling with staffing challenges. It's not only in restaurants finding skilled labor there, but it's in the manufacturers, it's in the distributors, it's finding skilled labor for back office and business process that have to occur. There's high employee turnover. This leads to increased training costs. So I need a way to automate all these business processes, because if my business happens to ramp up and so forth, I don't want it to be held back because I'm shackled by labor shortage. I want to be able to have my business ramp up or even manage it with fewer or more people. And what's driving this, there's just a lot of touch points, as I mentioned with the contracts, and there's a lot of touch points on the Excel spreadsheet. So as an individual person that's doing this reconciliation, they're having to do manual contract entries. They're having to do manual contract validation of the settlements, a lot of reconciliation. They're having to do the validation of the accruals. And this is creating revenue leakage. Things get missed. Things get dropped. That Excel spreadsheet gets deleted. So it's that across the entire business process, again, driven by the limited IT ecosystem, because it's such disconnected across the entire organization. So they just need to understand, I need to connect all these systems together to get that accurate pricing, accurate for the validation. So covered a lot. There's a lot going on. So when we talk to clients, and they're coming in for opportunities, they're coming in for that magic bullet, that what's the simple button. So what we tell them is that you want to focus on things you can control, because there are just things you can't control. That's the volatility, that's the labor shortage and so forth. So focusing on areas that you can control, the areas I talked about, automation of processes, automation and digitalization of processes to manage their simplistic approach of preventing revolution by stopgaps and KPI alerts. Using digitalization and systems to unravel complex markets, complex contracts, and then ultimately automating these business processes that we talked about due to a very shallow labor pool. How can I automate something that 5 people do and get them down to 3 and so forth? So is there any way? Again, as I talked about before, we're looking at AI, at least at Vistex. We are looking at AI could potentially solve this problem. How can AI address this? How can Gen AI address this and so forth? So there's a tremendous amount of opportunities in this space, and the customers are certainly working on that. And ultimately, it boils down to, what's that digitalization journey? Have you started it? Where are you at on it? Where are you at on the consolidation of an IT ecosystem? Which is the focus of what the CIOs who I talk to throughout different organizations, throughout the industry, are saying, that's my number one goal, is to downsize my software footprint, consolidate it, and then streamline my IT ecosystem. So appreciate the time. John, we'll see if there are any questions. A lot to take in the last 30 minutes, so go from there.
Okay, sure. The first one that came in, Joel, is you have identified 3 trends currently in the marketplace. Do you see any others in the near future?
Definitely so. As we continue to see the pricing change, what we also are seeing a lot of pricing change and so forth, is how to automate the pricing worksheets, pricing. There's still a lot of intervention on manual pricing. So one of the trends is how can I get more in front of my pricing? Number one, how can I get more in front of pricing through alerts and communicating my pricing to my customers? How can I confirm that the customers receive this pricing? So other trends is really how can I better inform my customers? Pricing is one aspect of it, or the primary aspect. How can I better inform my customers of changes to my business? What does that look like? Is that a portal? Is that some sort of some way of notification rather than email? So that's one of the trends we're seeing. How can I be better connected with my customers?
Okay, another one. What do you tell manufacturers in this channel who feel they are not ready from a technology standpoint?
That's a good question. Right in the back of my head, I always want to say, well, you better get ready because it's coming. I always tell people when they ask me, if they need to set up a timeline. You got to set up a timeline. You have to set up a touch point of that timeline with specifically milestones. More importantly, you have to get everyone on board, the senior management over, because that's a tough sell. It's a tough sell for IT because, I can get a value add, I can get a differentiation, but it is a cost expenditure. The positive thing, though, is that senior level executives are paying attention to the CIOs and saying, listen, we have to address this. We have to address this digitalization journey. We need to be started, otherwise we're going to be left behind. What I'm also seeing is within the channel, there are entities, the larger entities like large distributors are kind of putting the squeeze on manufacturers saying, we've made this journey. We're here. If you want to do business with us, you're going to have to get here as well. So we're starting to see, or we're not starting, we are seeing these entities throughout this tier of the distribution chain saying, you got to get started. So there's pressure coming from internally within this industry.
Okay, another one. Why do you think the revenue growth management concept is just now getting traction in the B2B channel?
Well, I think it's very much, the B2B channel is typically a little bit further behind on the retail side. Retail is retail selling into grocery stores is a little bit more cutting edge. Number two, manufacturers, the B2B side doesn't represent a huge portion of their business, but they're understanding that there's still a lot of growth opportunity there. So I think the reluctancy has been what we've talked about, the reluctancy of digitalization, consolidation, IT ecosystem. So I think now it's starting because those are the main components of revenue growth management. If you're not digitalizing, if you're not automating business processes, you're really not doing true revenue growth management. But I think it's starting to take shape because we're starting to see a lot more, and then the pressure, like I said, within the industry itself to begin this journey. So that's where it's starting to take hold. But why it took a little longer, it's hard to say.
Okay. Next, probably the last question here. Is the contract management challenge being impacted by the retail media trend? Are you able to cite any examples? It's interesting, Joel, that the next presentation is on a retail media, but that's the question.
That is a good question. And we are seeing this is impacting on the retail side. What's interesting, like I said, I speak to manufacturers both on the food service and the B2B side. There's a huge focus right now in consumer products on the manufacturers with their retail partners on how can they do better joint business planning. That whole area that channel is really going through a powerful metamorphosis of collaboration between the retailer. How can I collaborate better as a retailer? So there's a huge push by both the retailers and the manufacturers to get joint business planning. And the idea too of that, from a contract management standpoint, I want to encompass not only my contracts and my vendor purchasing contract, all those aspects. How can I encompass other marketing efforts into it so I can say, okay, here's the cost that I want to invest, and it relates to non-customer specific marketing costs, but the contracts that I want to set up aside. So there's this huge kind of focus on how do I can pull all that information and data together to be more collaborative with my retailer to get the perfect shopper experience and promotions.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions we had today. If the attendees have further questions, you can reach out to Joel at joel.cartwright@vistex.com. It's on the screen. And thank you, Joel. That was interesting, something a little different, and I learned a lot. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. Always a pleasure. Have a good afternoon and enjoy the conference.
Thank you.